gonna hear. There you go. Thanks for your patience in the waiting room, just finishing getting ready, but at least we are ready to start and kick off. So thanks a lot for joining. Obviously a very popular topic for early stage companies, knowing how to maximize non-dilutive funding, especially when it relates to grants, and especially now is a very timely period to look at that because there are two big Innovate UK grant scheme open, Biomedical Catalyst and the Smart Grant, plus any other scheme that you will hear about today. Obviously coming with the challenges of knowing how to navigate that, but also how to make a successful application that I hope our speakers today will give you some insights into that. So that's it for me. I think just in terms of housekeeping, if just for the presentation, you could keep cameras, microphones off, that would be great. But obviously we want that to be interactive. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat box and we'll pick up on them during or after the presentation. And we're very welcome in that. So thanks a lot. And I'm now passing the mic to Maciej. Maciej, over to you. Did we lose Maciej?
Yeah, we just lost Maciej.
That's very unlucky.
His laptop just yeah, it just died. So maybe let me make a start then while Maciej tries to get his laptop working. Yeah, sure, that's fine. So hi everyone, we're the EY team. I'm Ahmed. I have my colleague Alex Lane here on the call and Maciej, who should be on the call but just fell off unfortunately. So Maciej leads the UK grants team at EY. And we really just support our clients with applying for grant funding from Innovate UK, as well as other BASE competitions, navigating the application process, but also identifying the best opportunities, what is the most suitable opportunity for your different projects, and really trying to capitalize on the opportunities that are really becoming very numerous and very sort of things that can really propel your project to achieve their targets in alignment with the UK's targets for these competitions. So if we just make a quick start onto the first slide, Alex, if that's okay. So this is just a quick overview of the wider EY Innovation Incentives team. So we are a dedicated and highly specialized team focusing on innovation incentives, which covers not only grants, but also R&D tax credit, as well as patent box, really helping our clients capitalize on the different kinds of capital incentives that are provided by UK government. So our team is made up of a group of technical specialists, as well as industry and tax specialists. And it's really that mix of specialties with regards to the projects and the technical details, whether it be biomedical stuff or engineering, sustainability kind of projects, as well as working in a coordinated way with the accountants, economists, tax professionals to deliver these grant applications, these RDEC claims. So in the UK, our team has relevant experiences in many different sectors with proven methodologies. So obviously we've worked with a lot of clients over the years, and we have a lot of experience in delivering these grant applications and picking out the team members that have the relevant technical experience. And also where necessary, we draw on a global network of innovation incentives teams in Europe and beyond, where we sort of utilize this global network where necessary. Next slide, please. So this is one of our EY better questions. Should innovation be a function or a mindset? Is innovation something you are using to assist you in achieving your goals, or are you really trying to push forward with innovation as the key, as the target of your projects and what you're trying to do and bring to the industry? So jumping on to the next slide. Thanks, Alex. So quick overview of what we're going to cover today. So we're just going to go over an introduction to grants, what are grants, and then explain the eligible kinds of activities and give an overview of the competitions that are open right now. And then finally, we're going to close off with our services and how we can support you in applying for grant funding. Next slide. So here's just a quick poll to gauge everyone's sort of association and experience with grant funding. So if you could just let us know in the chat on a scale of 1 to 5 how familiar you are with grants and grant applications, if you just have no idea what they are, or if you sort of worked on some, maybe won a couple before, just to gauge everyone's sort of familiarity with the concept of grants and grant applications. And you can do that while I quickly go into the next section, and I'll be looking at, I see a lot of 4s coming in, so that's good. A lot of people quite familiar, but also some 2s. So still a few people not quite familiar. So we'll hopefully have a good chance to introduce you to what they are and how they work. So jumping into the next slide. Thanks again, Alex. So grants are financial incentives awarded on a discretionary basis for a specific future purpose. So when you have a project and the UK is trying to incentivize projects that are tackling certain targets, they use these grants to incentivize. Oh, Match, it's just joined. Brilliant. So they're whoops. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes, you're good.
I think my screen just died. Can you still see the screen?
I can.
It's fairly low.
Okay, I guess it's just on my side. Then let me just keep going. So yeah, once again, grants are just an incentive for you to deliver projects that align with the UK's upcoming targets and goals. And it's really important to not look at grants as a reward for doing something good, but really an incentivizing and enabling agent to make you achieve something that you weren't going to achieve without the grant. So as an example, you could get a £900,000 grant for a project that's aimed at carrying out preclinical validation of nanoparticles for cancer treatment. Another getting a $2 million grant for the creation of 40 R&D jobs in a new automotive innovation center aiming to develop low carbon technologies. So you can see here how this grant is enabling you to deliver something that aligns with the government's targets and goals for the industry, whether it's innovation, whether it's creating jobs. It's enabling you to do something that you wouldn't be able to do without the grant. These grants are awarded through a funding contract, which outlines some obligations. So there are certain things that you have to meet, certain requirements that you need to agree with the funding body based on the different programs and competitions. And these grants have to comply with subsidy control rules. So just a set of guidelines that dictate what can be funded, what can't be funded. And we'll talk a little bit in more detail about those later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So I can't actually see the slides, but hopefully we're on slide 8, which are what are grants given out for and how. So grants are typically offered for R&D and innovation, investments with job creation, environmental protection measures, training and upskilling. So these are the main targets that the government is really trying to achieve with these grants, and your project should be ideally tackling all 4 of those, but different competitions will be more geared towards one of those than the other. So some will be focusing more on innovative projects, bringing something new to the industry. Others will be focused on creating more jobs in a specific local area. So you really want to be sure that your projects are approaching or aiding the achievement of all 4 of these in one way or another. So in the UK, most innovation funding is centralized for delivery through Innovate UK, which is the main sort of funding body and the one that provides most of the funding competitions regarding innovation. But then there's also a lot of other funding, particularly CapEx funding, that comes through various agencies and authorities, typically local authorities that focus on upskilling and creating more jobs in specific local regions. There are also a lot of grants that come through BAYS, we're seeing more and more grants coming from them as well. And once again, we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between Innovate UK and BAYS applications later on in the presentation. Moving on to the next slide, we're just going to go over a quick overview of the current competitions that are out there right now with Alex Lane. Handing over to you, Alex.
Right. Thanks, Ahmad. So as we discussed, and thank you, Ahmad, for that overview on grants, there are multiple funding calls and opportunities out there. And the first one that we have that's open is the Biomedical Catalyst. It's been running since 2012, and this supports SME-led projects that are developing innovative solutions towards health and healthcare challenges. These funding themes include disease prevention and proactive management of healthcare and chronic conditions, helping to detect and diagnostics of disease leading to better patient outcomes, tailored treatments that can help underlying diseases and preventable cures, and development of digital health technologies. The total project costs for these are anywhere from 150,000 to 4 million, and the maximum grant is £2 million. The deadline coming up May 25th. The next fund available is the National Institute for Health Research, which has done their Invention for Innovation, program, supporting the development of medical technologies through medical devices, in vitro diagnostics, and a high impact patient focus digital health technologies. The I4I is split across 3 different competitions, one being their Connect competition, which is an early stage funding for SMEs, enabling them to get to a stage where they can apply for an I4I PDA. The next competition is the Product Development Awards, or the PDA, which is a collaborative projects to develop prototypes and clinical evaluations with patients, de-risking them for investment. And the Challenge Awards is the final competition for market-ready technologies to assist with stages between clinical evaluation and adoption. Innovation loans are currently available as well. And these are loans for SMEs that are undertaking highly innovative late-stage R&D projects that are looking to commercialize and deploy. Projects must focus on set themes, either tackling ill health, embracing well-being, and diet or food. Projects can include prototyping, demonstration, piloting, testing, and validation phases. The maximum loan request is $2 million, and 100% of the project costs will be included. 7.4% interest rate with repayments until the project is commercialized. And this currently has multiple rounds, but the last round will be in July. And the Life Sciences Innovative Manufacturing Fund is the CAP scheme for manufacturing project investments, covers cutting-edge innovations in human medicines, medical diagnostics, and med tech products. This includes curative and therapeutic treatments, earlier better detection and diagnosis of diseases, smart and robotic devices. The eligibility for these projects includes entirely new facilities, upgrades and expansions to existing sites, and the purchase of land, buildings, and equipment. And these are for large investments only, with the minimum cost of up to £12 million. And there's no fixed deadline, but once the fund will be closed once the 60 million budget has been allocated. And passing it back to Ahmad now to explain the funding details.
Brilliant. Thanks for that overview, Alex. And yeah, so with the funding details here, I just want to highlight a few key points about the application process, how it works. And what I really want to bring out is a balance between not seeing grant applications as this really lengthy sort of paperwork kind of thing that you're doing, but it's more of a very creative process where you're trying to bring out really the innovation in your project and the benefits of the project It's a process where you really need to think critically about your project and what it's bringing to the table. And while I go through this, please feel free to just interrupt me at any point with any questions you have, or drop a question in the chat, and I can get to it once we're through the section. So jumping onto the first slide, please, Alex. Thank you. So what costs and projects are funded? So if we can talk a little bit about the kind of costs that you can claim on a project. So obviously not all costs on your project are going to be eligible. So the first thing you can claim costs for, you can claim funding for, is the personnel or labor costs. So the employees that you have on your team that are working on this particular project, you can claim obviously their salaries based on their annual wages and the amount of time that they're dedicating to the project, plus an overhead, which is typically capped at 20%, and it is 20% for Innovate UK competitions. Then you can also claim subcontracting costs. So any other external companies that you are subcontracting to do work on your project, if they are delivering a specific part of the project, that can be claimed. Notably, these subcontractors do not need to be in the UK, although you are expected to sort of heavily justify and substantiate why you are resorting to overseas or offshore subcontractors to work on your project. You can also claim funding for material costs and capital usage costs. So these two are a bit similar and interchangeable, but really the difference between material and capital costs is anything that you are consuming and using out that you would consider material costs. So things like metal, the different kinds of resources that you need to do the testing for your products. And then capital usage is obviously equipment, machinery, things that depreciate in value and can have a value at the end of the project. Travel costs, travel and subsistence is also another cost that you can claim. Any sort of trips that need to be, that are necessary for the project to go through. And anything that doesn't fit within these categories can always fall under other costs, as an example, IP protection. But usually it is best to try and stick to one of these categories because you don't need to explain them. If you're putting something in the other cost section, then you really need to explain what that is and why it is necessary for project completion. A couple of examples. So, you just got a quick question here. Do you have to justify a tender for subcontracting? Maciej, do you have an answer for that one?
Yes, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
When you say, can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Yeah, okay. If you say, do you have to justify a tender? I think your question is, do you have to tender for a subcontracting contract?
Yeah.
The
and
answer
to show
is,
you've done it.
Yeah, the answer is it depends. Which is not a very helpful answer, I know. Usually, what you need to show is that it value for the taxpayers' money. So what that means is, if it's something completely novel, if you haven't worked with any company doing that subcontracting before, it makes sense to show that you've gone to tender, or that you've at least compared economically different options. If you have already worked with a company who's a quite close ally to you, all you have to say is that they know you very well, you've worked with them in the past, and you've already found them to provide excellent value for money, etc., etc. So there's ways of phrasing it. There's no formal requirement, but it definitely is necessary to show how it's good value. Now, this is slightly different when you go for EU funding. When you go for EU funding, you will usually, depending on the amount, you will have to show that you went to tender. Yeah, but even then, there is a way of circumventing that when it comes to, for instance, IP issues or things like that. If you have one trusted party you work with, you can sometimes justify not going to tender. But in general, it's not the going to tender that's important. It's the value for money that this contract gives you, because obviously a consultant that you pay takes a commercial fee. You have to pay them. You have to pay them on a commercial basis, which is less efficient than if you would do it yourself, unless you don't have that skill, obviously. I hope that answers your question. If not, we can pick this up later and provide you more explanation around that.
Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Maciej. So moving on to match funding. Oh no, sorry. Could you just jump back to the previous slide, Alex? Yeah, brilliant. So just covering match funding very quickly. So grants typically don't cover your project's full budget, and there is a grant intensity, or the percentage of the eligible project costs that the grant can fund. And this varies based on company size, as well as the technological stage or the technological readiness level of the project. So projects that are targeting more innovative, earlier concepts that haven't been developed, obviously those are higher risk projects. And so the funding intensity for those are typically higher, as opposed to projects that are closer to commercialization and have a lower level of risk associated with them. So as you can see, these are the typical percentages that you can expect to be funded based on the company size, whether it's small, medium, or large. And a few other sort of eligibility rules for grant funding is that a project is typically expected to be a collaborative in nature, which means that it's bringing together multiple partners, and funders really incentivize this to make sure that your project is covering the full value chain, and you have sort of the perspective and the involvement of different sort of companies and roles across the supply chain. And also, a lot of competitions typically expect you to include at least one small to medium enterprise in your consortium to really incentivize the growth of SMEs and ensure that they are having a stronger chance to compete in the market. Jumping onto the next slide, Alex. Thank you. So how are applications assessed? Now, Innovate UK typically follows a 10-question format, and these questions revolve around the innovation topic, market, team, project management, etc., etc. So the innovation topic is what your project is addressing, what is the need or the challenge that your project is really targeting, and how it will address this challenge, and typically in comparison to the current state-of-the-art solution. So when we're thinking about the biomedical catalyst competition, for example, if you're bringing in a new and innovative method of producing pharmaceuticals that sort of excels over the state-of-the-art, that is where you would highlight that. Next up is the market section. And this is not only the market that your project is targeting and how big it is, but also your go-to-market strategy, your route to market, how will you tap into this market. You've also got the project management section, which covers the delivery of the project, the different work packages that you're going to be delivering, a Gantt chart, coordinating tasks. There's also the risks. You need to cover the risks, whether that be managerial, technical, commercial risks. And finally, the two questions that really make or break an application, which are the value for money and additionality section. So the value for money is essentially validating and showing to the funders that your application warrants taxpayer money, and what is the return on investment that your project is making by having Innovate UK put this money into your project, and how you're efficiently utilizing every pound that they're putting in, and you've costed the different costs on your budget reasonably. Additionality is showing that that this grant is allowing you to do something that you wouldn't be able to do without the grant. So Innovate UK and other funders do not want to give money for a project that was going to go through anyway without the project. Like if we didn't get the grant, we would have still done it. They don't want to see that. They want to give money to projects that really wouldn't have gone through or would have been drastically different in their delivery if they had not been awarded the grant. And that is something that needs to be very clearly indicated in the application. Now, each application is assessed by a number of independent assessors to really give sort of a balanced view on the application, and you typically get to see their feedback at the end of the application. Each assessor gives a scoring, and then these scorings are tallied up, and projects that exceed a certain threshold are shortlisted, and then the program leads ultimately decide which projects go through and which ones don't onto the due diligence stage of the application assessment. Next slide. All right, so what makes a good application? So first of all, you need to be within the scope of the fund or the competition. And this is really like an eligibility check. So if you don't fit within the scope, then you're just immediately disqualified. And this is just making sure that not only your project meets the requirements of the competition and it's fulfilling all the sort of targets and eligibility checks, but also that your project team consists of the right consortium members. You have an SME if that's necessary. You're meeting all the requirements of the competition essentially. But you also need to show that your project has impact and relevance to the target area of the competition. So how much you're really contributing to the goals of the competition and how you're helping achieve and making an impact on the target area with your project. You also need to show credibility with your application. So you need to show that your team has the capabilities to deliver this project and that the project implementation and the technical challenges and risks have been thought through very clearly. And you know what the tasks and the requirements are, and you have the necessary resources to undertake this project, ideally with reference to previous and past experience. And finally, value for money. As we mentioned, you need to indicate very clearly that the costs that you've put in on the project are realistic and they make sense for the proposed work and the outputs that you're proposing, and you're giving a good return on investment for the taxpayer money that's being put into your project. And now I will hand it over back to Maciej with a quick overview on the funding lifecycle.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Thank you very much, Alex. And apologies earlier for disappearing so dramatically. I received a blue screen warning, so I got disconnected from the call. So really what we like to do in this little section is share some of the experience we've had over the past years in us supporting companies apply for funding, and just give you a little bit of insight about how the funding life cycle works and how we specifically help companies apply for funding, because this will give you an idea of the sort of things you have to do when you apply for funding to be successful. So if I can please have the next slide. So normally when we think about submitting a project, when we speak to a client about submitting for a project, we really think about 3 different phases. So you've got the strategy phase, in which you really align yourself with the fund. So that's before you start delving into the fund application, but it's when you have a potential candidate project or multiple projects and you really start looking for funding. You can the scope alignment check that Ahmed was mentioning is really important. One of the things we can do as well is link in with the relevant people at the government. So most funds have a specific funding manager or funding director that if you know them, you can speak to. And you can get some guidance on how good your project fits. You may even be able to speak to people who received funding in the past to get their experience and just see how well that fits. And I really think, although it is not really work that you're doing in terms of completing an application form, this preparatory work can save you quite a lot of headache, because if you're out of scope, and you do all this work to submit an application, but it then isn't successful, it's obviously quite discouraging and annoying. So you don't want to be in that position. So once you know your scope, what we typically do is we have a look at what is required for the funding competition. We have a look at what you can deliver as a company, and if you then need partners, it makes sense to bring in partners to fill that scope gap. So it doesn't really have a lot of benefit for you as a company to pick up work that you wouldn't otherwise be doing, because obviously it's additional work for you that doesn't really yield any benefit. So that's where you can bring in a partner to fill that scope. Then before you actually start to move into the implementation phase, which is really the writing, you again want to test the scope. And I know we're banging on about this a little bit, but the scope is the central piece of what makes your project fundable. Once you're at that point, and once you know your scope is okay, and once you're ready to start writing, what's really important as well is to be able to capture your project in a fairly high level, top-down, simplistic way. So have a 1-paragraph description of why your project is impactful, why it makes sense within the competition, and that will allow you to reframe every single question, because as Ahmed was saying, typically you get about 10 questions in an application, and each of those questions test your project from a different angle. So they test it from, is it innovative? Do you know how to go to market with it? Do you have the right team to develop this project? All of those different angles are about the same project. So you need to have that central description rather than go question by question, which will lead to a non-consistent application unless you have that central framework. So what is then really important is when you draft your application together with somebody else, to really have a good review of that application. And what we would always recommend is use the review structures in place. So for instance, the knowledge transfer network, the KTN, can help companies with reviews. You can ask people who were successful in the past. You can ask colleagues who weren't involved, but really make sure that the language is crystal clear. And also when doing the review, think about who your audience is. So for instance, the innovation loans that you saw before that Alex was presenting, it's a fairly generic funding program, which means that the evaluators typically are not all experts in what you may be doing. When you're going for something like a biomedical catalyst with a biomedical application, you can expect the people to read the application to have a very in-depth knowledge of that sector. In other words, the language and the positioning of your project can be a little bit different. Once you've submitted your application, you go into the sort of admin or maintenance phase. Sometimes there is an interview process there as well, in which you have to sort of describe your project in front of a panel, but that will then ultimately lead to a reward. An award, which is quite frustratingly followed by a due diligence step. So that due diligence step is nothing else than looking at the financial viability of you as a company, looking at the data that you've provided. For instance, if you've claimed that you have gone to tender, as the question suggested earlier, can you substantiate that with those tender documents, things like that. So that's the due diligence phase. Once you've got the green light from the funding authorities, you can start your project, you can deliver your project, and during the project delivery, you'll have to make funding requests as well. So the best way to think about it is, once you start your project and you have the green light, a certain amount of funding gets reserved for you by the funding authorities. You do not get that full amount of funding automatically in your account or anything, but when you show that you're delivering the project according to schedule, according to scope, etc., you can then draw down some of that money. But it's really important to realize it's no guarantee yet, because if you go off in a different direction, then you may actually not receive the money. The project can still be stopped. So it's really important to already think about that before you apply for funding and lay out the project plan in a way that you know you can adhere to it. Can I have the next slide, please? Right, so in terms of how we approach this situation, really, and this is just another view of what you saw there, is first we do a project idea analysis, then we do a concept development, then we help with the application, and then we do negotiation, which can be the due diligence and the presentation in front of a panel. But I think really important are steps 1 and 2. Steps 3 and 4 you're probably familiar with, or you can imagine quite well what it includes. But steps 1 and 2 are the preparatory steps, in which you need to look very, very closely at the project idea, the scope fit, what sort of gap you have, drive your consortium using that gap. And then when you do your concept development, that's really building out that storyline without necessarily still looking at the application. And again, I know this sounds like preparatory work, but I cannot insist enough on how important it is to get these first 2 steps right, because then the application will almost write itself. It doesn't really write itself, but it will almost do that. And it's a lot clearer what you have to put in there once you've got your steps 1 and 2 ready. Right, can I have the next slide, please? And in practice, so what we do is we really have a number of different support models that will also provide you an idea of what is important when you apply for funding. So we often help companies throughout the full application preparation. So we go through all of the steps that you saw in the slides before, but we sometimes also do just reviews of proposals that a company has written. So we call it a health check or pre-mortem. In other words, we take the position of an evaluator, we look at it very strictly, I should say, and try and poke any holes in it, which is always helpful because it helps you strengthen the narrative. We can also do a funding options analysis, which is really the step one, is taking a really honest view around, well, what is actually available to you, and do you fit the scope? Is it going to be worth your while to try and apply for that funding? And then lastly, the project management piece, which alludes a little bit to what I was saying earlier. Once you start your project, you need to report your progress compliance, which for UK funding programs is relatively doable, although it can still be tricky. But for EU projects, it can be quite substantial, especially when the funding amounts are a little bit bigger. And then funding planning is again looking at a landscape review and how you can plan that out into the future. What sort of project should be starting when, to make use of the existing funding programs as best you can. Right, can I have the next slide, please? A couple of case studies here. As you can see, there's quite a large variety of different clients that we've helped. We've helped a medical startup company. We helped various multinational companies. Obviously, we help with full applications or with assessment of funding opportunities. We've helped with loans, growth grants. So these are non-innovative grants, but more CapEx investment grants. So we've looked at this from all different angles. So we'd always be happy if you have any specific investment cases that you're discussing to have a chat to see, you know, what you would have to consider to come up with some viable funding options. But hopefully this session has been useful, and we're always happy to answer any follow-up questions that you may have. And I would also like to thank Alex and Ahmed for their input so far.
Thank you much. So are there any question from the virtual audience? And if not, I have a quick one just to warm things up. Can I just ask, how much would you say you can recycle all this prep work for grant? Obviously, it's a lot of work when you prepare for your project application. And let's say, unfortunately, you are unsuccessful for what you asked for. Can you recycle a little bit of that work for another application, or maybe to put in your business planning for going for private funding?
You dropped off towards the end there, but what I heard is, can you recycle it for another application or for resubmission? Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, I think anything.
Yeah. So I think those are two different questions, right? But whenever you look at a given application, there's a couple of different things that you need to present, and some of it is company specific. So that is team members, the size of your company, the sort of customers you work with, how you go to market, things like that. That will have a relatively good carryover. And then there's things that are project specific. So things that are project specific, you really want to start from the top, right? So you really want to do that again. And I would say that is probably 60% of the application. However, there are certain things like Gantt charts, risk registers, and there's quite a lot of work to do, and there is a way of doing them that we know is well received by the funding body. So a little bit frustratingly, when you look at an application, they will provide you with guidance of what they want to see in the question, and they'll say, well, you can add a risk register, for instance, but they won't give you a template for the risk register. So how you present it, not just the content, but how you present it, can also give you an additional benefit over other applicants. So once you've gotten a format that works well and that you know has received good feedback, you can recycle that as well, which will save you time. Now, when it comes to resubmissions, obviously it's extremely tempting to start with the application you previously did and tweak that based on the feedback that you've received. Now, the only thing I will say is sometimes it can work, especially if you're close in terms of, for instance, if you've received 84% scoring and you know that you need to be north of 86%, you can try and get those few extra points by addressing evaluator feedback. But you need to be really honest with yourself and look at the feedback and see what it actually means for your project. So is that more a presentation something about the presentation of your project, or is there something more substantial related to the scope? Because if that is the case, it will be very hard for you to recycle it. You may be better off starting from the top with that.
Thanks, that's very useful. Are there any more questions? And if not, I think as Machi, Alex, and Ahmed mentioned, you can definitely reach out to them. You've got their email address, and this session has been recorded, so I will circulate the link to you, and we'll also resend their contact details so you can get in touch. So that is the last chance to ask a question now. I'm going to take it as a no. So I'm going to say a big thank you to presenters and everyone who attended. Very brief mention from my side is further sessions like that are upcoming. So there is one on the 17th of May with the EY team again, a different one, and it's more to talk about private investor readiness. So just to talk about how private early stage investors are reviewing applications and propositions, and just tips on being ready for seeking early stage investment. And then there is a further one on the 24th of May, which is about contracting with confidence. So obviously as early stage companies grow, they need to contract more, whether business related services or technical services. And so it's to know how to do that in the safest way to protect IP and any business sensitive matters. So I'll send you this link to recording, link to the presenters as well, and link to further sessions. And I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Several years ago now, I had somebody over a chair and they picked